Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Zachariah Renfro, and today we're going to talk a little bit about Kant, Bentham, existentialism, and phenomenology. We will also talk about the trolley problem. We'll talk about intersubjectivity. So it should be a very fun time. I'm real excited to get into it. You'll see right here we got a little funny picture of a humorous version of the trolley problem, so it should be a pretty exciting time. Here's an overview of what we will discuss. One thing I want to point out is we will have a nice bit of interesting interplay between Kant and Sartre. It's kind of interesting to see how Kant's idea of the categorical imperative gets carried through with Sartre. We also have a humorous comic from Existential Comics. Uh, they've been doing great work in philosophy, and I really recommend checking them out. Here we have the trolley problem as developed by Philippa Foot and also further popularized by Judith Jarvis. The premise of the problem is that you are the track operator. You're standing there by the switch. You see a trolley coming down, and it will either hit one person or it will hit five people, and you have to decide where the trolley is going to go. You have to decide where it's going to hit. This problem has been used to both argue for and against utilitarianism. Philippa Foot used it originally to explain positive and negative duties, but that's not so much our conversation for today. This is just a little bit of preamble. So when we get into Bentham and get talking about utilitarianism, that we kind of understand what it is. Here we have a little humorous comic about the trolley problem. We get to Jeremy Bentham, and he's an act utilitarian. That means that he believes the morality of actions is dependent on each independent action and that we have to calculate the moral value of it every time we make a decision, right? He believes that the morality of something is based off of maximizing the good or the utility for the greatest number of people. And he was a hedonist in that he believed that pleasure was one of the highest goods, right? He says in Principles of Moral and Legislation that there is only one true good, and it's ingrained in us naturally, and it's the love of pleasure and the fear of pain, right? So we see from that that the basis of his moral decision making comes down to those ideas of utility. Now, utility, broadly speaking, can apply to pleasure. It can also apply to material goods such as money, right? It's not good in of itself, but it's good for a purpose, right? It can apply to other forms of good as well, such as social good. But one of the big ideas that Bentham came up with was that you can quantify levels of goodness and that you can make a mathematical decision based off of those levels of goodness, right? So when we look back to our trolley problem, Bentham says the answer would be easy. Saving five people would always be superior to saving the one. So if you're the track operator, you need to flip the switch and hit the one person. The problem with that is, though, at what point, as a moral reasoner, do we have to create and accept responsibility for something like that? Do we want to live in a world where, if you were the one person, another person can basically combine, sentence you to death, right? And, obviously that's a bit of an extreme scenario, but it is one of those things that with utilitarianism we do kind of have to think about. If we're basing actions on the greatest number or the greatest group of people, then what happens to the smaller number? What happens to the lesser, right? And do we, as moral legislative beings, have rights to subject them to harms or death based on, the greatest number? To me, that seems like it could be just a step away from mob rule. Another thing that Bentham talks about is that utilitarian actions have to respect the rights of others, and that you have to try and find happiness for all as much as possible. So, for example, suppose there was a group of sadists and they wanted to kidnap and torture someone, and this group of sadists would get extreme pleasure from it, but of course a person receiving the torture would not get any pleasure from it. Bentham would say that that would be an unethical action because it does not maximize happiness for the one person that's suffering. It maximizes happiness for the group, but it doesn't maximize happiness for the one suffering. But again, we go back to the trolley problem. What happens if you find yourself in a situation where you have to decide, you have to delineate, and one group is going to be a winner, one group's going to be a loser? How do you make that choice, right? Bentham says one of the main criteria that we can use is suffering. He says that suffering is the basis of moral decision making. So if we come across a person, an animal, or anything else, and it can suffer, then he says that we need to give it moral consideration, and we need to try and minimize the suffering for that thing as much as we can. But then that also brings up a problem. Think about farming, for instance. Unless you are an extreme vegetarian, it is very hard to have a healthy diet that includes the appropriate amount of proteins without somewhere down the line causing suffering to an animal, right? We can probably say that putting cows and pigs to death to eat them will cause them suffering, right? So how much moral consideration should they get in that decision making? These are some of the flaws that Bentham tries to correct and he tries to answer, but in my mind, he's ultimately unsuccessful. He leaves a lot of open questions. Bentham, he argues that it's not really so much the intentions that matter of our ethics, but, the outcomes. So again, he's an act utilitarian. He says we need to examine every action, but not for what we want to do, what we're planning on doing, but the actual outcome. And this, again, can create some bizarre situations. A thief goes to break into a house, and as he busts out the window, he finds, a woman laying on the ground, poisoned from carbon monoxide, but him busting out the window, let enough air in for her to regain consciousness. According to Bentham, that would be a positive action. That would be a good action, even though the thief's intention was a bad action. So there are some logical flaws when it comes to utilitarianism that Bentham couldn't correct. John Stuart Mill does try to correct them later on, but even he has trouble with that as well. One thing I want to go through the calculations of is Bentham's hedonic calculus. This is his method for determining what is a good action. It's got 7 steps, and we'll walk through one of them. Is the pleasure or the pain received from it intense or mild? An intense pleasure is better than a mild pleasure. Is the duration long or short? A long intense pleasure, such as a happy love and marriage, is better than a short intense pleasure, such as getting high on drugs, right? Certainty. How likely is it to happen? An alien might come down and abduct you and make you their king, and that would bring you a lot of pleasure, but it's very uncertain. However, having a drink of beer might bring you some pleasure, but it's absolutely certain. How soon will it happen? Is it one of those things you're going to be waiting your entire life for it? Or is it one of those things that you can get tomorrow or get in within the next hour? Will it repeat? Is this a pleasure you can get multiple times, such as eating a good sandwich, or is it something that you'll only get once in your life? Will it be followed with pain, right? The purity principle. A pleasure that comes without pain is better than a pleasure that comes with pain. So, for example, say you get a lot of pleasure from eating spicy food, but you have a stomach issue where if you eat spicy food, it causes you terrible stomach pain later that night. Bentham would say that that's not a good pleasure. And then finally, how many people will be affected? We go back to our trolley problem, and that's one of the main things with this. How many people are going to be affected? Well, obviously, 5 people being hit by a trolley is worse than 1 person being hit by a trolley. So it'll be a lot more in the case of the 5 versus the 1. Now, going through this hedonic calculus, we can see from Bentham that pleasures are kind of value neutral. And now what does that mean? So, Bentham would say that it is just as morally good to drink a beer and smoke a cigar as it would be to exercise and do philosophy, right? He doesn't believe in higher and lower pleasures. Now, when we get to John Stuart Mill, that's something that he has a big problem with Bentham, is that, you know, Mill says there are higher and lower pleasures and that we should pursue the higher pleasures, pleasures of the mind or things that purify the body, over the lower pleasures such as alcohol and gambling. In addition to that, Mill, when he comes around, he has a problem with Bentham's act utilitarianism. You know, John Stuart Mill says that we need to create rules based off of pleasure. So, for example, if we see that murdering someone harms them and creates less utility, then we would make a rule saying that it's not good to murder people, right? So Mill believed that not only could we not actively calculate the utility of every action, it's unfeasible, but he believed that it wasn't a good way to live your life second guessing the morality of every single action. You have to have some amount of certainty in the actions that you perform. So, what do you think of utilitarianism? Just kind of ponder over this as we go through. Is utility the ultimate measure by which we measure right and wrong, or should it be? Which takes us to Kant. Now, Kant and the utilitarians are kind of placed as two sides of one coin, and in many ways they are kind of opposites. Not only were they sort of temporally close to each other, but they have completely different ideas about what is morally good. So this is pretty interesting. So Kant starts out with this idea that morality is a rational science, whereas Bentham believed that morality was a type of legislation, right? Bentham come from a law background, and he wanted to incorporate that kind of legal reasoning into morality. So because Kant believes that morality is a rational science, he argues that moral truths are scientific, and a scientific truth is essentially a command. So what does that mean? A moral command exists to guide you. It's not something that you can really decide to obey or not, right? It is a command, a moral command. So with that, these moral commands, they come from universal human reason, right? All rational beings can come up with these moral ideas a priori, and we are only free when we live a reasoned and rational life, and a reasoned and rational life includes morality, right? So because morality is a facet of reason, and because we can only be free if we use our reason, then for us to be free, we have to act morally according to Kant. And there's some idea to this. Think about the people who who you've met in your life, who are really like controlled by their passions, right? They fly off the handle getting mad. Maybe they got a problem with road rage, or maybe they get upset over the littlest thing. To me, those people would not seem to be very free, right? Because they're slaves to their passions, or slaves to their emotions, kind of what Hume had said, right? And you cannot be free if you cannot make a decision, and you cannot make a decision if you're controlled by your passion. So what Kant is saying does make a lot of sense, right? Because reason is control of passions, and morality, as Kant defines it, directly needs you to perform an action based off of a command. You have to will to want to do it, right? So for Kant, the only true good is the good will, right? You will for something good. You have the intent to do something good. And that's a big difference between Kant and Bentham, right? Bentham's concerned with consequences. Kant says, hey, we can't know what's going to happen. We can't know the consequence. So, we just have to have the good will, and we have to intend for there to be a good consequence. So according to Kant, these moral things that we want to do, they're absolute commands. They're not dependent on goals or desires. So, for example, something such as don't steal, it's a moral command, right? And it's justified using the categorical imperative. So we only act through the maximum through which we can act that we can will at the same time it become a universal law. So what does that mean? That means that you only want to act in a way that all other people could act that way. And if it's either creates a situation that, you or other rational humans wouldn't want to live in, or it's self-contradictory, then, it fails the test of the categorical imperative, and it fails to be a moral command, right? It fails to, become moral, right? So, for example, you think about killing. Kant says you don't want to murder people. You don't kill people. We wouldn't want to live in a world where people just killed each other, for fun or for the slightest things. In addition, society could not exist if people were just out murdering each other all the time. So it's internally contradictory. So therefore, it's an immoral action. And we can see it's an immoral action, and we must respect that moral law, right? Because for your actions to be moral under Kant, they have to come from reason. They can't come from desire, right? So according to Kant, let's say you see a homeless person on the side of the street and you feel very sad for them, so you give them $1. Kant would say that's not a moral action because you did it out of sympathy. You were being controlled by your emotions. You didn't do it out of reason. For that action to be moral under Kant, you would have to be able to formulate a moral reason why you would do it. So, for example, you see the homeless person on the street and you say, if everyone gave homeless people $1, then it would be good for society. So therefore, you would want that to be a moral law, which would create the moral command to give a homeless person $1 if you see them, right? So that's how morality comes about under Kant. Now, many of you, reading this might think something similar to what what Schopenhauer says about Kant, which is that, not only do you have to have these kind of moral rules, but you have to have a genuine loving kindness. Schopenhauer says that, when we think about a good or moral action, such as a mother protecting a child or someone helping a sick person, they're not built from duty, that they are built from loving kindness. Now, Kant argues that those things aren't truly autonomous. They're not free decisions, that they might have good outcomes. They might benefit the people who these things happen to, right? But they're not moral. They're only moral if they're reasoned. And I can see the argument for that, right? Say you're taking care of a sick person. Which reasoning for taking care of a sick person seems more moral? The person who does it because they feel sad for them, or the person who does it because they feel it's a moral duty? To me, the second one seems to be a stronger moral quality. Kant does say it's okay to feel good when acting morally, right? But good or bad feelings shouldn't be your main reason. If you want to accomplish things through methods that are not, that are not related to moral law, that'd be like a hypothetical imperative, a contingent command. If you're thirsty, drink water. If you want your friend to feel better, take him to the doctor, right? So the big thing that we need to really grasp with Kant is you can create actions that have good outcomes, but they're not necessarily moral actions. For Kant, the moral action is a specific category of action. It's not the only action you have to take, and it's not the only action you'll ever take in your life, right? Kant recognizes that in the metaphysics of morals. In your life, not every action you're going to make is a moral action. Some actions are what you might call a non-moral action. Choosing to either drink water or drink Kool-Aid is not a moral action, right? It is what you would call a non-moral action. So Kant, that's one of the things he does real well for us, is he separates, morality from certain types of actions and other types of actions. So when we look back at Bentham, every action we do is going through this hedonic calculus so that every action can become more or less moral. With Kant, he's making a clear dividing line. He says, you've got your moral actions over here. It's a small set of actions that are based on reason and duty. And then you've got your other actions here, which are hypothetical imperatives, and they're just based off of goals or wants or desires, right? So you could even do, things which have good outcomes for non-moral reasons, right? They would just be hypothetical imperatives. You see your daughter is feeling sad, so you take her to the store and buy something, right? It's a hypothetical imperative. If you want your daughter to be happy, you take her to the store, right? That's not a moral action. It wasn't done from duty, but it still, you know, had a good outcome. And Kant recognizes that sometimes actions which are non-moral, that don't have that moral criteria to them, can have good outcomes. He's just saying that, we have to make sure we're delineating between what's moral and what's not moral, because calling something moral that isn't moral is a disrespect to the moral law, and it goes against the commands of universal human reason. So for Kant, how would he deal with the trolley problem, right? We get back here to the trolley problem. And what would Kant say? Well, it's hard to say. It might end up being one of those situations where it's a hypothetical imperative instead of a categorical imperative. Do you want to save 5 lives instead of 1 life? Well, then you divert the trolley to hit the 1 person. Do you want to save the 1 life over the 5 lives? Then you divert the trolley to hit the 5 people. But it may not be a situation where you can define a moral duty out of it, because it could go either way. For example, we are setting up our categorical imperative. Would we want to live in a world where trolley operators always choose to sacrifice 1 person instead of 5 people? Well, yeah, that seems reasonable, unless we're the 1 person on the track, in which point we might come to a different conclusion on that, right? So you could make a moral case, a reason-based case, but you could also come up on the other side of that case. So when I think about the trolley problem, and this is something that, my views have changed a lot over time, it may be one of those situations where it is hard to determine morality, right? Because when we think about it, if you're the track operator and you do nothing, it hits 5 people, right? You do nothing at all. But as a trolley operator, or as a person standing by a switch, do you have a duty to put 1 person to death to save 5? That's tough. Well, what if the trolley was already heading towards the 1 person? Do you have a duty to try and save the 1 person instead of the 5? Right, so defining these duties can get a little bit tricky. All that is to say that the Kantian answer might not be too much different from the utilitarian answer, but the difference is with the Kantian answer, it might end up being a hypothetical imperative rather than a categorical imperative. It might end up being one of those things where you can't derive morality from it because you can't come up with a clear categorical imperative. Now we'll see from Kant that he's hugely influential when we get to existentialism, but I want you to think about Kant a little bit. Think about, how can this be applied to your own life? Do you think that there is a difference between moral and non-moral choices? Do you think that we need to try and bring morality into every choice like how Bentham does? Or do you think that we need to just recognize that some choices aren't moral no matter what we do? And for the choices that aren't moral, we just have to try and make the best decision we can. Now, before we get into existentialism and phenomenology, we need to talk a little bit about the concept of intersubjectivity. It is an idea that comes up with phenomenology and existentialism, and a big part of that is because they're very closely related. Existentialism is a bit more closely related to ethics, whereas phenomenology is a bit more closely related to psychology. I call it a meta-psychology. Intersubjectivity is this idea that as beings living in the world, we can only understand ourselves through others by recognizing that others are also beings in this world, and that we can kind of mirror our views off of them and mirror our interactions off of them. It's the recognition of self and others leading to the greater understanding of self, right? So, for example, you've met people in the world who think the world revolves around them. To me, that seems a rather unhealthy way to be. And it seems that that person who thinks the world revolves around them doesn't quite understand themselves and their relation to the world. They haven't developed that intersubjectivity, right? So we will see this concept come up with the existentialist and the phenomenologist, and we need to understand that it's this idea that you can only become fully aware and fully developed when you recognize that the other people around you are not only thinking, feeling beings such that you are, but recognize that they have an effect on you as much as you have an effect on them. So we'll start with a little bit of background on Sartre. I'm putting Sartre and existentialism before phenomenology because in some ways existentialism is a little bit easier to explain than phenomenology. So I'm starting here where it's easy, and then we're going to work our way back to phenomenology. So Sartre, he was born in 1905. He lived through World War II. He served in the French military as a meteorologist during World War II and was captured and held as a POW, right? Like, he's one of very few philosophers to have ever been a prisoner of war. Now, at some point, he gets out of the prison camp. There's a little bit of debate over whether he escaped or was released. He was released for medical reasons, but there are people that say that, it was kind of like a falsified medical reason. So there's a little bit of debate about that. It could be the case as a little bit of both. Maybe he did have a legitimate medical reason, but maybe he over-exaggerated it so he could get released. He comes back to Paris and becomes part of a secret intellectual resistance movement called Socialisme et Liberté. And they wrote a bunch of articles and little secret newspapers to try and dissuade people from Nazi ideology and try and dissuade people from supporting the occupation. What amount of success they had is debatable. Later on in life, Simone de Beauvoir comes to heavily criticize Sartre for not taking a more active role in the resistance. But, he was participating, and the amount of impact they had, again, was it's debatable. It might not have been very much, but at least he was doing something, right? Had he been caught being part of the secret movement, he probably would have been sent back to the POW camp or just shot, right? So he was doing something. He was doing the thing he was good at, which was philosophizing, but his contributions to the resistance effort probably were minimal. Now, when it comes to existentialism, at least as envisioned by Sartre, and we got to keep in mind, Sartre wasn't the first existentialist, We have Kierkegaard, who's called the godfather of existentialism. He was a Christian, and he argued that, we are responsible for ourselves and our faith, and we are alone basically in this world, and we have to seek out to God through like this radical act of faith, this leap to faith, he called it. Sartre takes that idea, and he takes ideas from Nietzsche, and he takes ideas from Husserl, the phenomenologist, and he develops his own conception of existentialism. It revolves around this idea of radical freedom. We're free in the world, and we have to come to grips to that. We are responsible for every decision we make and every action that we do, and our lives are the culmination of all of our decisions, which plays nicely into the phrase existence precedes essence, right? Prior to the existentialist camp, there was this idea that human beings had an inherent essence. They had a telos, right? Going all the way back to Plato, that humans are born with a purpose, right? A purpose to reason, or a purpose to worship God, or a purpose to do good things, or to live rationally, or pursue pleasures, right? Sartre says, no, we aren't born with a purpose. We are born into existence, and then we have to develop this purpose. We have to develop this essence. This essence develops over time every time we make a choice. When we make a choice, we are building towards our essence, and our essence is the culmination of all these choices. When I talk about Kant's influence on Sartre, in his book Existentialism as a Humanism, he talks about this idea that if you make any kind of choice, you choose eggs over sausage, that you are willing it for all of mankind. You're saying that's the best possible choice. I think of this as kind of an extreme version of the categorical imperative, right? Sartre took that idea, the categorical imperative, and he said, okay, categorical imperative only applies to moral choices, but I'm going to make it apply to everything. As you live your life, the person you get married to, what you have for breakfast, what color clothes you wear, these are all choices that to Sartre you would want to make happen for all of mankind. And because we have so much responsibility for creating this image of the world in ourselves, it causes us anguish, right? We despair over these decisions we have to make. We have to make these difficult decisions all the time, deciding how we fit into the world and how our roles play into the world. And that causes us terrible pain because we don't know what the outcomes of these decisions will be. We don't know how they're going to affect the world. We can make a best guess off of probability, but we're not sure. And we're not even sure if we're doing the right thing. Because when Sartre was an atheist and a communist, but, Sartre says even if God is alive, that doesn't matter because most people aren't getting direct messages from heaven, so they can't know. And even if they are, they still have to interpret those messages, right? So, a person who, say, this is an example Sartre gives, spent his whole life failing one thing or another and decides it was God's message to him that he needed to go into clergy, that is an interpretation of the message. So even if his God is there willing these things, the person performing the action, the individual's human, still has to make the choice. They still have to understand what that means, right? They have to make the decision. They have to exercise that radical freedom. Another example of that, when it comes to this moral decision making, is Sartre gives an example of a young man who has to choose between staying home and caring for his mother, whose whole life revolves around him, or joining the resistance to fight the Nazis. He says there's no general rule we can turn to. We can't divine from the categorical imperative what we ought to do, and we can't divine from utilitarianism what we ought to do. He says that we're responsible for our choices. We're the sum of all of our undertakings. And what does that mean? Well, that's got some disturbing implications. That means that all these character flaws that a person might have, being a coward, being short-tempered, being mean-spirited, being nasty, whatever, Sartre says that the person is completely responsible for that they can change those things if they want. So in some ways, existentialism is a very depressing worldview, right? That whatever happens, particularly if you're someone who's unsuccessful in life or someone who faces a lot of failures, Sartre says, well, you're responsible for that. You made all the decisions, so you just have to live with your failure. But on the other side of it, it's kind of a liberating idea, because if you are someone who's having a lot of trouble, then you can come out of that through the right decisions. You can make those choices to come out of that hole and lift yourself up. So in some ways with existentialism, we kind of see a bit of a start of the positive psychology movement. We see a start to this idea that we are in control of our destinies. When it comes to that control of destiny, now we got to get to the point where we're, making our choices. Sartre says that being, that is existence, existing in the world, is an experience we take part in, and that we have to recognize that existence in all other people. And that from recognizing that existence in other people and in ourselves, we can start to come to moral understanding, right? We can do that through self-recognition, through intersubjectivity. Our understanding of each other's purpose is made clear by understanding that every person has their own purposes and their own, choices that they have to make. So by understanding that, it brings us more in tune with the world. So we've got to respect the being of other people. We have to interact with them, but that still doesn't quite lead to moral decision making. So let's talk about it a bit more. Because Sartre says there's no a priori moral values, and that we invent the moral law for ourselves, right? So we're thinking back to Bentham, we're thinking back to Kant, we're inventing the moral law. We can't, according to Sartre, judge moral actions of other people based off of their outcome or based off of our own personal values, because those people had their own values they acted from. But Sartre says that that doesn't mean we live in a world of complete subjectivity. That doesn't mean that, it's a moral free-for-all. He just says that moral judgments have to be judged based off of other criteria, such as self-deception, deception or falsehood, misunderstanding the environment, right? Like, a person can still be wrong, but you have to argue from a different perspective. So say someone commits a murder. You can't just say, according to Sartre, you can't just say, oh, you committed a murder and that violates the categorical imperative. You have to look into that person's reasoning and say, oh, you committed this murder because you thought it would make your life better, but you were wrong. It's actually made your life worse. So therefore it was an immoral choice because you made it inauthentically. You were self-deceived. You didn't understand the intersubjectivity of the world, and you didn't understand your place in it. So you were self-deceived and you made the wrong choice. What is the right choice will depend on our values, and our values are what we will into the world with respect to other people's being and with respect to intersubjectivity, right? Freedom is the goal of our will, according to Sartre. We all strive for freedom. Sartre, to some extent, was very fascinated with this idea of people escaping slavery and escaping, the chains that bind them, right? So he believes that freedom is our ultimate value. We are striving for freedom in our lives, and he says that that's the ultimate goal. It's not happiness, it's not utility, it's freedom. It is this desire to be free from the shackles of universal decision making and to be able to live our lives authentically as best we can, and to take that further. Because Sartre was a communist, he did believe in these ideas of community, these very strong communitarian ideals. He believes that we can live our values towards community, and we can create community. We can bring it into existence through moral decision making. So all that is to say that for Sartre, we're responsible for our decisions. Our decisions have to respect our being in ourselves and the being in others through subjectivity. And when we're judging moral decisions, we can't apply our values to other people. We have to judge why their decisions were wrong based off of their own values. So it makes moral legislation a lot more difficult. What do you think? How responsible are we for our decisions and for our values? Do we create our own lives? Do we create our own futures? To me, I do see some truth in Sartre, right? Like, I can see where his ideas are coming from, but how do we account for these people that are born with terrible luck, who, no matter what they do, they seem to have been destined to fail, right? Like, it would seem to me that those people, no matter what decision they made, it was already decided before them. So that's one of the challenges of existentialism, is it assumes a certain amount of agency, but what if the agency has been stripped from a person due to factors that they cannot control? Now we're on to phenomenology, and I've grouped Husserl and Heidegger together. They come a little bit before Sartre, at least in the timeline of philosophy. But I wanted to do this section last because it covers subjectivity, intersubjectivity, and it covers ideas of being, but in a slightly more complicated way. So I wanted us to kind of get the basis of them before we started diving into them. So as I said before, I think of phenomenology as like a type of meta-psychology. That is, that it is the background to psychology. It is a way of thinking about existence and about the mind that exists before we can start doing empirical psychological analysis. So what does that mean? We'll start with Husserl and then we'll move into Heidegger. He recommends that we suspend judgment of things. We use something called the phenomenological experience. We recognize that we are beings in a body who are affected by all the things around us as possible. And we try and suspend judgment, suspend pre-existing biases, try and put ourselves in an original experience position, right? He says that, we can't accomplish this 100%, but we can get close. This is kind of a follow-up from Descartes' idea of radical skepticism, right? But Husserl isn't wanting us to be skeptical. He's just wanting us to try and remove as many boundaries of the world, of our thinking, as we can, so that we can experience things from a brand new, objective, original experience, right? We can try and see the world in the way that a child might, right? We're experiencing something for the first time. Because to him, that allows us to understand the essence of objects and experience. These things have their own essence. They have their own reality tied to them. We take part in that reality. And by trying to strip away all of our pre-existing notions about them, we can kind of experience them in the truest form. Because, according to him, reality and consciousness are co-created together. They act upon each other. Reality is something that's happening all the time, even when we're not conscious as aware. But when we are conscious, we make actions which affect reality, and reality does things that affect our consciousness and our existence upon the world. We are intersubjective to reality in the same way we are intersubjective to other people. It's a consistent building process of two ideas, right? These ideas work together and build each other up. So for him, moral actions comprise of those actions which we've taken from the essence of things or the essence of experience using the phenomenological method. So we set down, we try and remove all of our pre-existing biases, try and experience it as a new thing, and then we connect the values seen in reality, right? Because these things that exist in reality have their own values with our own feelings in life. So it's not a type of emotivism as much as it is a connection with these pre-existing things, right? So we use that phenomenological method to say, oh, stealing is wrong, and we want to live in a way that avoids that. So let's think back to our trolley experiment, right? And I guess I should also talk a little bit about the existentialist method, right? So the existentialist method says, we go back to Sartre, and he says that, hey, whatever we do with the trolley, we have to make a decision based off of authentic values, right? We decide what happens, whether we pull the lever to say sacrifice 1 or to sacrifice 5. We have to authentically and genuinely come to this decision and recognize that it's our decision to make. We can make the wrong decision, but we have to have that freedom to recognize it. So we get to Husserl. He says we need to disconnect from our pre-existing biases. And what he says is that we need to, examine the situation. We see 5 people on a track. We see 1 person on a track. We see that in those things, there's a 5 lives and 1 life, 5 beings versus 1 being. And then we look to our own internal view of things. And we try and see the connection between our own subjectivity and the reality before us, right? The reality is objective. It's 5 or 1. But we try to see what is our connection to that reality. It could be that our connection to the reality is that we recognize that there are 5 beings there, and we wouldn't want to end the lives of 5 beings. We recognize that reality, and we make a decision based off of that. So the phenomenological method is one of those things where it's a little bit wonky to use. It would be hard to try and come up with these ideas on the fly. It really only works in situations where you can really think in depth and in detail. And I think that's what Husserl really wants us to do. He wants us to really think about our decisions and think about our values in life. Which leads us to Heidegger, who was a follower of Husserl, and he comes up with this idea of Dasein. Dasein is a fancy word for being in the world, and we as beings in the world are free to make any number of actions. Not an infinite number, but we have a large number of actions that we can take. But when we're going through our daily lives, we might not realize that, as beings in the world, we have a limited amount of life, right? So the first step for Dasein is to recognize that it is a being in the world with a limitation on its life. It will die, right? We look at the example of a carpenter building with a hammer, right? He's building with the hammer, and then the hammer breaks. That is a reminder to him that he will also break. He will also cease to exist. In the same way the hammer was destroyed, he will become destroyed. So for Heidegger, for us to live good lives, we have to recognize our own death. We got to confront it. We have to recognize that our essence is mortal, and we have to live in accordance with that. That is being authentic, right? So authenticity to him, that recognizing death and that facing it, is the path to correct action. It's the path to morality. It's the path to good decision making. And because we have to recognize our mortality, he says that we live in anxiety, right? And that we seek to escape this recognition of our own deaths through inauthentic action. That could be sitting and watching TV, it could be gambling, it could be drinking, right? He says those are inauthentic because they try to escape the reality that someday we're going to die, right? We will end in this world. So what should we do? That doesn't give us a whole lot of moral choices. That's just a recognition that, yes, we are anxious about our own death. And, you go asking many people, a lot of people do not like to think about their own end, and they will do anything they can to kind of avoid it, right? Because it's depressing, it's scary. We have our lives to live and like to think that, we're going to live forever. We don't like to recognize that at any moment, we could come to an end, right? So what does he recommend? Well, first, because of intersubjectivity, because we are beings in the world who can only come to understand ourselves through others and our relationships to others, he recommends that we form strong relationships and friendships. He recommends that, we become beings connected to others, because that connection to others helps us understand the world we live in and find more authentic experience with these other beings who are also aware of their own existence in the world. He also, and keep in mind, this is in the 30s, he recommends us against technology. He believes that technology hinders our experience of the authentic world. It's an escape, just like a drug or an alcohol. If you listen to the radio too much or watch too much TV, you're just escaping from your authentic lives, right? He doesn't really give us a lot of recommendations for how to live morally, but he says before we can live morally, we have to first live authentically. So from the phenomenological perspective, we first have to recognize our own end. We first have to recognize what we are. We have to know ourselves. We have to come to understand who we are before we can live morally, because anything before that is just inauthentic action. It's an escape. So as you see, phenomenology, Husserl, Heidegger, these ideas are, one, a bit complicated, and two, they're not very straightforward, right? Like, we look back to Kant, and it is complicated, but it's relatively straightforward. We look back to Bentham. It's only a little bit complicated, but relatively straightforward. But when we get to the existentialist and the phenomenologist, we start getting these layers of complication that make it a little bit less straightforward, make it a little bit harder for us to determine what's right or wrong, what's good or bad. We have to keep that in mind as we go through, that with phenomenology and existentialism, there is an answer in the world, but it is not a straightforward one. It requires us to recognize our existence in the world, recognize our freedom, recognize our eventual demise, and then try and live authentically according to that. So I'm going to end this with some questions for you to kind of think about. How do we value things? What is the method by which we value things, and how do our values relate to morality? what are the commands of morality? Kant is very clear that there are moral commands, but the rest of the thinkers we talked about don't say as much. The phenomenologists say that there is morality out there. It exists in reality. Morality exists in reality, but that we have to recognize it first. We have to come to bring ourselves in sync with that pre-existing morality, right? Do our choices create our reality? The existentialist and phenomenologist really try and bring home this idea that we are in control of ourselves, and this idea that by our own choices we alter our reality and our understanding of the world. How do we even relate to the world? How do we relate to each other? If we're Dasein, a being in the world who is unaware of his own death and can only live authentically once he recognizes his death, how do we, after becoming authentic and recognizing our death, how do we connect to each other's? And how does our relation to others create duties, right? Heidegger recommends friendship, and he recommends building close relationships. How will that create duties to other people? These are some things to think about. So I hope that you've enjoyed this short lecture. I hope it's helpful to you if you are a student in my class. I can't wait to hear from you during the weekly meetings. If you're someone who found this on YouTube, please like, subscribe, comment. Let me know what you think. I really think that this is some interesting stuff, and I hope to hear from you soon. Thank you. Bye.